Hi, welcome to the Divine Insight Show. Thank you so much for joining us wherever and whenever you're doing so. It's no accident that you're here. I'm thrilled to introduce you today to this week's guest, William Arntz. Will is a physicist, software engineer, entrepreneur, producer, the mastermind behind What the Bleep Do We Know, and an author. He's written simulators for the early Star Wars program, created software that the Fortune 500 world runs on, created What the Bleep Do We Know movie and books, and co-created the book of visionary prophecies, the not so little book of surprises with Deirdre Hade. He's with me here today to talk about his most recent book, How to Suffer in 10 Easy Steps, Discover, Embrace, and Own the Mechanics of Misery. Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And as soon as I got the pitch, I was very excited. I was sold immediately just reading the title, and I couldn't wait to dive in. But I have to say, I've had some people that I have shown the book to and just talked to, and they were sort of like, no, you should get rid of that book. Why would you want to know? Why would you want to suffer? Like they kind of assumed that it would create more suffering, which I thought was kind of ironic. I think people just often don't necessarily get the satire, but what inspired you to write this book?
Well, what inspired me, I wasn't thinking about suffering or anything like that. I was walking through the living room one day and Deirdre, my wife, was laying on the couch. Her back was out. She was laying face down. I said, honey, how you doing? She didn't say anything. I said, do you want to go to the kitchen, maybe have some Chardonnay, do a little something? She just kind of groaned. I said, what are you doing? She goes, I just want to lay here and suffer. And I just stopped. I mean, like no one says that. I'm like, what? You're just going to lay there and suffer? And she sort of stirs a little bit. She goes, I want to perfect my suffering. And I just started to laugh. And she and I know a bunch of people in the self-help genre. So, and I'm always kind of rolling my eyes a little bit about some of it. And I go, oh, you want to perfect it? Someone needs to write a self-help book, How to Suffer in 10 Easy Steps. So she starts to chuckle, I start to chuckle, and we start riffing for about 15 minutes on this whole idea of a self-help book on how to suffer, sort of being a satire of all the self-help books that promise the world in so many easy steps, whereas becoming a billionaire is not necessarily easy, and 5 steps isn't going to do it. So anyway, we start laughing, and then 15 minutes later, she's sitting up and she's feeling much better, and I am too. We go into the kitchen. It's one of those things where you think, okay, you had a good laugh the night before, and you'll forget about it. A month later, I'm still thinking about this crazy book, and I decide to start writing it just to send to some friends as kind of a satire. And sure enough, a year and a half later, the book's done. I just didn't stop writing because as I got into it, I realized, oh my, there's really something here that needs to be communicated and thought about and written about. And so it was game on, and here we are.
Yeah, here we are. So in the context of your book, what is the S word? I know what the S word is, but what's your S word?
Well, the S word in the book is suffering, because the thing is, people generally, how are you doing? Oh, my boss fired me, or just the, oh, good, how about you? I mean, people tend not to say the S word, that they're suffering. They'll say a circumstance, oh, my car just got stolen, or, oh, my, daughter just flunked out of college, or, whatever it is. But really, the internal state is they're suffering over or with something, and people just don't say it. And because of that, often people don't deal with it.
Yeah, so I frankly kind of agree with, I think, what you might agree with, but the whole crowd of the only good vibes and only good thought narratives, I think, can be kind of dangerous for us. I think it tends to cause us to avoid anything that doesn't feel good, and really incapacitates us from dealing with anything we don't like. And it's perpetuated by these online communities and social media where we can just ghost people and have about 2,000 friends. What are your thoughts about that as it relates to suffering?
Well, it's interesting. You are the third person within the last week and a half who said that. And these are people who are in, they're in spiritual communities and whatnot. One's a minister at a Unity Church. And they've said the same thing, that there's this taboo about saying anything quote unquote negative. Oh, don't say that, it'll bring in, the bad energy or this sort of thing. And so basically it's like, well, light and darkness are part of the world, if you haven't noticed, and you got to deal with reality. And if that is happening, if there is something quote unquote negative in your life, you got to realize it. Ignoring it won't go away. It'll probably just get worse. So that's one of the big things in the book. And part of the satire is to kind of undo some of that, in spiritual, like any group, there's always taboos. There's always things you don't say. Oh, don't bring any negative thing in. Oh, don't think about that. Don't ever think you won't be a billionaire, because that'll stop. I mean, all those sort of things that people trot out becomes yet another dogma. And personally, I don't like dogmas. So part of this thing of the book is blowing up some of that dogmatized thing around suffering, because guess what? Things happen. Ask Buddha. I mean, his first noble truth, human life is suffering.
It's so interesting, because I was going to actually ask you later, literally, about a Buddha statement that talks about, the way in which most of us suffer, or one of the ways we suffer most is the way that we argue with reality. And I was going to ask your thoughts about that.
Well, that's there's a couple things on that. There's also this thing called the klishas, which is 5 things from the Vedas, and they talk about the reasons for suffering. And the first one is all suffering is caused by a misapprehension of the nature of reality. And they list a bunch of other ones. It's associating with the intransient, it's fear of death. They said, but in the end, all those other ones are all contained within the first one. That basically all suffering is a misapprehension of the nature of reality. So if you're afraid of death, for instance, then that's because you think death is real. You think death is the end of you. Whereas it's in reality, it's just a transition. It's just putting on a different suit of clothes. So reality is a big deal in all of this. And so a lot of this, I talk about the suffering being the gorilla in the room, because if you're in that reality, you got to deal with it. Otherwise, like I said, it won't go away and will probably get worse.
Yeah, thank you. And I think a lot of us, it's also sort of human nature to not want to I guess, what am I saying? If you're conflict avoidant, sometimes if we're having something we don't necessarily want to talk about or bring up because it feels bad, particularly in partnership or something where we're like, oh, everything's okay. It's okay. I could be happier, but I'm all right. And I think a lot of people stay in relationships that aren't good for them, in part because they're in some ways deluding themselves about what they truly want. How do you think that applies to relationships with respect to what I'm talking about, particularly the way that we suffer in relationship?
Well, it's really the same thing. And in fact, my wife said, most stuff she's done a lot of counseling of people, among other things. And she said, what I find is like most suffering happens in relationship, especially your close relationships. And part of that is because when you're in a close relationship, those people just start pushing your buttons. It's more inevitable. And so, given that, I think the wise thing, and this is what I've done, is you just accept that things are going to come up. And those things that come up are the parts of evolution. I mean, the bottom line that I came to with all this is that why does suffering exist? It's evolution. It's something where you go through changes, because otherwise, if everything is just hunky-dory, you just tend to go along as it is. And of course, the planet is living that right now, right?
Right.
I'm here in California. We're in lockdown. Everyone's in lockdown. All of our habits, all of our routines have been disrupted. I mean, this is a major reset going on. So the question is, is this something that we're suffering over? Is this just, the universe is giving us a bad day, or is there something to it? And personally, I think there's something to it. And I think this is a way you're going to see huge changes in society, because people have been forced to get off the jag of busy, do, get, consume, spend. Whoa, how am I? Oh, I just got a text. Oh, this, what's the news? That whole jag that this world really has been pretty much running on, it just got hit the pause button. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's fascinating from like a personal consciousness level, what we'll create in our lives versus what's going on in the collective. But as I was reading your book, one of the first things that was really, really profound for me was the way in which you broke down the concept of suffering, and you clearly laid out three main factors in how things work that kind of set us all up to suffer. You talk about duality, you talk about entropy, and you talk about belief. We won't have time to dive too deeply into them, but I'm curious, what led you to that discovery?
That's a good question. Well, I don't know what led it to me. I just, as I started writing, I just started thinking more and more about it. And as you mentioned earlier, my early job was as a physicist, and I have degrees in that stuff. So I just tend to think in those terms. And as I thought about it, I thought, well, these seem to be the factors that really are doing it. Like belief, a lot of your belief determines how suffering hits you. For instance, if you have a belief, some people believe that the universe is unfair, that it's just a random universe we live in, that there's no intelligence beyond what's in our heads. And so when horrible stuff happens, it's just part of the lousy setup of living here. I mean, that people have that belief. Yeah. And so when you have that belief, that means when things happen to you, there's nothing you can do about it. You're screwed, basically. So, once you have that belief, that then is going to start influencing how you deal with the suffering, as opposed to someone else's belief. In my case, it's like all the suffering that happens, there's something about reality that I'm not getting right. I'm not perceiving something right. I have or maybe it's some blockage in me, or maybe it's some old trauma. Who knows what it is? Mm-hmm. But there's something to investigate. So instead of just, bemoaning my fate, I may do that for a little bit just because, I don't know, it's fun, I guess. But then I get bored of that pretty quickly, and then it's like, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting because what I like to talk about is, okay, it's okay to be not okay. Allow yourself to just not live in this narrative of I have to be okay all the time and pretend, which inhibits us, right? But it's like, okay, well, just set a timer. Give yourself a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, whine, cry, have a fit, let it out, and then move on. But what I also found so effective in reading the book, and what I found myself doing several times, is laughing out loud, which is a very, very serious person talking about a serious topic of suffering. I think people might be curious around why would you make it funny or humorous. But I find it's an effective tool for approaching difficult or challenging topics. But can you share why you brought such a wonderfully humorous and satirical tone to the book?
Yeah, I mean, it started off that way. And I kind of have a humorous, sarcastic sense of humor, and an odd sense of humor. And in some respects, my favorite thing in the world is to make people laugh. My wife always gives me grief because we'll be in these social settings and I'll say stuff that's probably inappropriate and everyone roars laughing. She goes, "You shouldn't have said that." And I'm like, "Honey, I'll always go for the laugh. You can say it's a character flaw. I don't care. I'll always go for the laugh." So, as I started writing, there's a lot of opportunity for humor. I mean, if you think about it, like a lot of what comedians do and get laughs for, it's saying stuff they're not supposed to. It's for, and they're talking about often suffering situations cast in a humorous tone. So that was kind of why I did it. And then another thing is, you know, if you're writing a book about suffering, you don't want people to suffer reading it, okay? It's like if you're making a movie and your main character is going through boredom and depression, you don't want your audience to go through boredom and depression. You want them to go into insight, different from what the character. So the book about suffering, you don't want the people to suffer through it because there's enough of that anyway. So that's it. And then the final reason is, it went way back to my original story with Deirdre on the couch. We're laughing now about writing this crazy book, How to Suffer in 10 Easy Steps. And her back's not bothering her so much anymore. She's sitting up, she's got her feet propped up. We're going back and forth coming, oh, there should be a suffering hall of fame. There should be this, that. And she's laughing now. And her back wasn't hurting so much. So it turns out one of the prime ways to move beyond whatever suffering state you're in is laughter. So that's why.
That's pretty awesome. And now about the 10 steps. So why 10? Was that just in the moment of inspiration and then it led to 10 ultimately, or how did the 10 steps come up other than that original inspiration?
No, it was the original inspiration. It was the original inspiration, and then afterwards I, you know, reverse engineered the 10 steps. It's not like I figured out the 10 steps. It's like, oh man, now I got to come up with the 10 steps. And part of that is you see it a lot. I did a little research. There's a whole lot of quote, 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 self-help books out there with the 10 easy steps. So it just seemed to be the magical number. So that's why there's nothing cosmic or metaphysical about the fact that there's 10. It just, I could have done 20, I could have done 5, but 10 seems to be the number. Now, the second half of the book, you know, is the 6 slippery steps to end suffering. And in that case, actually the 6 I came up with were the ones that I thought were the most important. So the first half of the book is satirical and hopefully insightful and, you know, enjoyable. And then the second half I get a little more serious and say, okay, we've had our fun and games. Now let's see what strategies there are to realize about the suffering and to move through it.
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate, you know, all the concepts that you cover here. You know, you dive so deeply and cogently with compassion and grace into topics like addiction, forgiveness, attachment, reality. We won't have time to go through, you know, all of the 10 steps, but I'm curious, as you were writing the book, what surprises came up for you? And in particular, which of the steps did you find helpful in your own life?
Well, here's the biggest surprise. The sufferometer. And I have one. Obviously, it's in my hands. I made it.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I had a chapter called The Pseudoscience of Suffering. And at the end, I say any science, even a pseudoscience, needs a metric. So therefore, I'm creating a sufferometer. And this is, again, you know, you laugh, I laugh, you know, we all.
Sure. Yeah.
And then at one point, I made one, obviously. And I put it up on the refrigerator. And I just decided, for I don't know why, that I would start using it. So in the morning I would get up, or in the afternoon when I was in certain states, I would put from 0 to 100 where the sufferometer is. No suffering is 0, you know, total suffering is 100. So, and I started doing that. And I started noticing, first off, it wasn't as easy as you'd think in order to peg how much you're suffering. Again, because we layer with all this stuff. So just the fact of looking at it and saying, how much from 0 to 100 am I suffering right now? It was a bit of a mind blower, because I started realizing I'm actually suffering about things more than I think I am. And by putting a number on it, I was like, oh my God, this is really bothering me more than I thought. And then now that I brought it to conscious awareness, I'm like, well, actually, it's not that big a deal. I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. And once I realized that, the old sufferometer would go back down. And so I started doing this, and I started realizing that thing of externalizing it and actually having to put a metric on it was actually really helpful. And that was totally surprising to me, because I came up with the thing just, for fun. And it turns out it's actually a useful tool.
Well, it's really fascinating because it's a unique way to express, the unconscious, the thing that's going on behind the surface. And as we understand about energy, right? Energy wants to move, right? Stagnant energy is blocked. It's stuck. So unless you're consciously asking yourself the question about, am I stuck? Where am I stuck? And in your very specific question, where am I suffering? Without asking that question that many people don't ask themselves, they're just in pain and they're not sure or pretending they're not. It's really fascinating, because it's like just that very shift alone opens it up. It brings it in, releases it, and then there you go. And a lot of people, I talk a lot about, well, make it real in some way, say it out loud or write it down so that it becomes in the physical realm something real. And then oftentimes, much like you, it is something that can be then expressed and released. So it's fascinating. And I love for those of you who are listening and not necessarily seeing the video, what Will brought out was his own homemade chart that had a dial on it from 0 to 100 with beautiful writing of the sufferometer at the top, which was really, really cool. So you can make your own at home with a dial and work through that. And also, of course, I encourage you to read the book as well. But why do you call the threshold of suffering, or the pseudoscience of suffering, pseudoscience?
Well, I did that because originally I had a whole thing describing why I did that. And the reason I did it is I have a chip on my shoulder about that, quite honestly. I made What the Bleep, right? And What the Bleep, I got all of this stuff about it's a pseudoscience and and articles, and we got pretty much across the board horrible reviews from everyone. It's a pseudoscience, they made all this up. And it just pissed me off, because first off, I have a degree in this stuff. I know what science and isn't pseudoscience. Secondly, there were these journalists who were saying, oh, those people you interviewed who had PhDs and professors at Stanford, oh, they're not real scientists. I'm a journalist. I have a degree in journalism. I can tell. So there was, so I have this thing about that. And so I just decided to call it pseudoscience, because in this case, it kind of was, because I was doing some graphs and charts. The one thing I came up with was called the threshold of suffering. And there is this chart where you have pain versus suffering. Pain's on the y-axis and suffering is on the x. And because basically some people associate pain and suffering as one and the same, but it's not, because you can be in pain and not suffering. You can be in suffering and not pain. So the idea is, as the pain increases, let's say you stub your toe really bad. Okay, ouch, it really hurts, but you're not really suffering. It's just like, ugh. Next morning you wake up, it's starting to swell, and now you're having trouble walking, so you can't go anywhere, but you're still kind of dealing with it. And then it starts turning green. And then you freak out and you're suffering, because there was a moment where the pain gets to the point where you just suddenly, it's a threshold, and now you're suffering. So it's the notion of trying to put some sort of metric between what is painful, and when suffering kicks in. So that's kind of why I called it a pseudoscience, because I'm doing graphs and charts and talking about cycles of suffering and this sort of thing. So, but it really goes back to having a chip on my shoulder, which I'm probably still suffering about. So there you have it.
Well, it's fascinating, because I was a social scientist. I have a degree in criminology and sociology, which, when we talk about beliefs and we can actually create metrics around what people's beliefs are about any given thing, religiosity, homophobia, whatever that is. And so we would like chart that sort of thing. And I just find it interesting that the resistance that people have is often because they just don't necessarily like what they're hearing. But it's just fascinating too. And I think, it's kind of, we're in this world where anybody with an opinion and a phone writes words onto a screen and projects it out as if it's gospel. And as a lawyer, people putting out all this stuff out there, and I'm like, well, my law degree might not be the same as your Google search, but I kind of have an understanding of it, at some basic level. But so when it comes to suffering, I guess, just sort of bigger picture, can we ever end our suffering? Can it just be done? Can we just be done suffering?
Well, according to Buddha, the answer is yes, because he had gotten to the point where, he's transcends suffering. He comes up with his noble eightfold path, which is how you basically end suffering. So, according to him, and he did it according to the things, then the answer is yes. If you ask me, I haven't done that, so I'm just theorizing. I know it can be lessened. In the chapter that I wrote on Buddha, I entitled the chapter, Buddha Kicks the Habit. And I did that partially because it's, kind of clever, I guess, hopefully. But also because once I came up with it, I'm like, oh my God, so much of our suffering is a habit. And think about it, you're 4 years old, you don't get what you want, you don't understand how you can't have it, and so you scream and cry and throw a tantrum. That's in our psychology, that's in our neural nets. And so much of the suffering we do just becomes a habit. When certain things, or you could say it's a trigger, it's the same thing, something happens and then you go there, and really the reality of the situation, it's not that big a deal, but because of the past, because of the habitual response, you go there. So a lot of it is habitual. And so therefore, whether you can totally end it forever and ever, amen, I'm not quite sure, but you can definitely get a handle on it and lessen it to, I think, a pretty remarkable degree. And if you believe Buddha, then the answer is yes.
Thank you. And is there anything, like we talked about before, any sort of surprises was your creation of this sufferometer, but just relating to like world events right now, this is a very potentially scary time for people who might be living in fear about what's going to happen to them, and potentially people are affected financially in many ways in their lives, a lot of people. So there would be a lot of perceived suffering going on right now. What would you share about, the lessons and the steps that you have in your book to people who are sitting in that fear right now?
Well, first off, some of the fear that people are experiencing is not necessarily coming from themselves. And I want to explain that we're in a situation right now that has never, ever happened in the history of humanity. And that situation is pretty much everyone on the planet is experiencing the same crisis at the same time and knows that everyone else is. That's never happened because of our communications, internet and whatnot, cell phones. We all know now what's happening in the whole world, and it's affecting everyone. Now, there's been times where the planetary consciousness was sort of linked up, like during the moonshot, there were certain things. After 9/11, people were doing it. But then again, 9/11, if you're in America, and especially New York, it was affecting you directly. If you're over in France, it was like, an interesting news item. But this is something where it's affecting everyone. The same thing is affecting everyone at the same time. Globally, billions of people, and that has never, ever happened. So you talk about the collective unconsciousness, everything's energy, whatever you want to say, there is this thought form gripping all of humanity right now that's really intense. And I got this where about a week ago, I was walking through the kitchen and I suddenly was overwhelmed by a feeling of dread, just dread. And I was like, where did this come from? I was just feeling pretty good. And then I realized that there's the collective unconscious that we're all swimming in is affecting everyone. So that's a long answer to say a lot of the fears that people are experiencing is just everyone's feeling it. Everyone, it was something. And so humanity is now united against the common energy. And you see these science fiction movies that use War of the Worlds where the Martians come and for once the nations stop being petty and fighting with each other and join together and maybe that. So this is a bit of that going on where basically we're all now experiencing the same thing. We can't really blame anyone. There's no quote unquote villain, at least a human villain. So it's a really different way to look at what's going on that, again, we've never had before. So because of that, it's really a wild time. You're going to see structures falling apart, economies falling apart, habits falling apart. All this stuff is going to be going on. And so I think for people, they just got to push in the clutch and say, oh my God, here we go. Because it's huge. It's enveloped the planet. And again, think about this, 3-4 months ago, it was, a little virus in the city in China, somewhere in the interior where no one even knows where it is unless you're in China. And now it's around the world. So this is a whole different type. This is globalization. The end result of globalization is what we're seeing here. So that's what I've come to in this, that people, and realizing what's going on, and there's an opportunity here to basically assess your life. Say, okay, all these externals that I've been living and doing for all this time, they're all pretty much taken away. These habits are taking it away. What's important? What's important? People are having dinners together for the first time because all the kids aren't running off somewhere and dad's not coming in late from work and mom's not coming in late from work and blah, blah, blah. So it's an opportunity. And so my advice is for people to, the best that they can, see it for that. And like I said, push in the clutch because things are going to change.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It's such a time of, forced introspection. And I think, I don't believe in coincidences personally. I believe in like synchronicities, that this was something that we had some sort of a soul agreement on to bring out into the world because it's needed. And we're still in that time of discomfort around it, right? I think, growth isn't easy. Much like to your first point, we don't necessarily grow in times of comfort and ease. We're not getting stronger by hoping we get stronger and praying for it at night. We find opportunities to demonstrate it in our lives. But with respect to, the topic of learning how to suffer and trying to do our best to make our lives more comfortable and happier really with ourselves. Is there anything else that you would like to share about your work or this book or a lesson, a step that we haven't already talked about before we close out the show today?
Well, I'm thinking about my 6 slippery steps to end suffering. And the reason there are slippery steps is you have to use wisdom when employing them. It's not like an easy, I'll just go into forgiveness and then it'll all work. Because, for instance, it's a slippery step because there's times where forgiveness is not the thing to do, or surrender is not the thing to do. It's like the example I use in the book is in the 60s, the civil rights movement. Some people were saying to the African Americans, look, this is just the way it is. You just have to accept it, and that's what's going on. And then there was other ones who said, no way. no, we're not going to surrender. We're not going to accept this. This is wrong. And we're going to do something about it. So there's the idea that you have to use some wisdom as to how you deploy things. So in the world we're living in right now, I would say surrender is the thing. I mean, you can bitch and moan about you can't do this, you can't do that, but there's not much you can do about it. You know, we're in this situation, humanity, we're all in the same boat here. And so the thing is, you have to accept this is the way it is. How long is it going to be this way? We don't know. We don't know. And, you know, pulling your hair out and counting off days on the calendar till it ends just isn't going to work. So I think this is one of those things where we have to be a bit humble, and we don't have control over the situation. So we'll do the best we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you being here with us today, sharing your story, your experience. You're wonderful. I hope that people do read it. I do. I'm going to give it another read here as well, and I might buy it for a couple of people as well. But I really appreciate your time sharing this with our audiences all over, and for being with me today.
Well, it's been great being here. And like I said, well, here we are all at home. So there was nowhere else to go, but I'm really happy to be here. And thank you for making it happen.
Yeah, you bet. And how can folks get more information about you, get a copy of the book? I assume people understand about Amazon and all of that, but what about you? How can they get more information about yourself?
Well, first for the book, I have a website, because everyone has websites, and the URL is howtosuffer.me, which is easy to remember, howtosuffer.me. And if you go there, actually that's on my, I have a holding company that does everything, Captured Light. That'll get you to that page, and then there's a thing of contact and more info and other stuff. So once you're there, the URL is capturedlight.biz. But like I said, howtosuffer.me will get you there, and then, you know, off you go.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. And thank you all for watching and listening. Really appreciate your time. Have a wonderful week.